the Homestead Studios in Santa Clarita, California, it's just the Tip-Sters with Melissa Morgan.
How do you do?
If you've got a tip for Melissa, an unsolved murder, a crime in your neighborhood, a way to wash a cat without the involvement of bloody appendages, anything, tell us about it by calling the Tipster hotline at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837, or send an email to jttipsters@gmail.com. You just might hear your tip on the podcast. And now, here's your host, taking a break from accessorizing her murder board with unicorn glitter, Melissa Morgan.
And more cowbell. I'm not sure why I took that big deep breath. It was like I felt like having to say more cowbell would take a lot of energy and oxygen out of me, so I had to prepare.
Well, you know, we've been on vacation. We just got back today from vacation, and we're exhausted.
I need a vacation.
Yeah, we need a vacation from vacation.
It's very stressful, the vacation. So, bringing up our vacation, which was very close to home, but a lovely area. We were gifted with some time at a fancy-ass resort in Orange County, not far from where the Golden State Killer did some heavy-duty damage. But anyway, more about that later. But while we were there, something that could have helped you tremendously when you had your cat Jim, to bathe him.
Oh, yes. Yes.
You can explain why you needed to, because cats bathe themselves. But anyway, go ahead. You can explain why you needed to bathe him.
Oh, well, that's the whole thing about the cat and the bloody appendages thing. Yeah, I had a cat when I was a young man in my 20s and early 30s. I had a cat named Jim. He was a very lovely cat. And when he was young, he was probably about a year old or maybe a little bit less. He escaped for about a week and a half, 2 weeks. I thought he was gone forever, but he showed up. He showed back up, and he had obviously encountered a skunk. He smelled like old tires and skunk, and I had to bathe him, which is not something I wanted to do. And believe me, it was not something that Jim wanted me to do either, because I almost died in the process.
Right. So before I get to what would have been very, very helpful to you and Jim during that difficult time in your relationship is that Skunk and Old Tires is the newest fragrance from Paris Hilton.
Did you come across that at the resort where we were?
Yes, they were selling that in the gift shop.
Yeah. I should point out, too, this was not just some hoity-toity resort. This was the hoity-toity. I mean, it was...
That just sounds like you need a Claritin because you have been overcome with phlegm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty hoity-toity. So, right. Part of the hoity-toityness is that it's, overlooking the ocean. And we found this out the hard way. It is a 15-year-old resort that has been built on a previous bird sanctuary, which pissed me off a little bit. I'm like, why the fuck did you have to build here? There's a lot of good real estate. Fuck you and your goddamn giant hotel resort. However, we had some visitors. The first 4 days of our vacation was monstrously horrible. It was gray and dark and cold, but we are polar bears, so we kept, we had 3 balconies, one off the master bedroom, one off the living room, and one off the second bedroom, which we entirely didn't need because there were 2 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, and we only had 2 butts. We didn't need the 3rd bathroom, but anyway.
Well, I split.
Oh yeah,
my butt split the time between 2 of the bathrooms.
Like a fucking feral animal that just marks your shit everywhere. You peeing all over the floor and
did not
around
pee
the
on
fireplace. Okay, all right. Anyway, we left those sliders open with no screen. So several times during the first several days. One day it happened 4 times, and then another day it happened 2 or 3 times. So a total of 6 or 7 times. Not unfriendly birds would just, come in. And we were up, a couple of levels. We weren't like on the ground. So they weren't like walking and like, hey, got any shit in here? They were flying in and like, hey, got any shit in here? And I was like, "Go, bird, go!" They're like, "No, I'm looking.
Yeah,
Wait, I'm looking around."
They would just come in, and they're blackbirds, and they would come in. They would come in, and they would just like march around and just ignore. They would not be flustered if you came up to them.
No,
they'd just say, all right, just hold on. I'm looking for food. I'll be gone in a second. Then they would take off.
Right. Well, sometimes I had to kind of show them into the next room, wherever the next balcony was. So what happened on Friday morning? Apparently I was asleep, and producer Mark is like, well, there was an event. I got up and I'm like, what's happening? Apparently producer Mark heard some screeching, some hawk screeching.
Oh, I didn't know what it was. It sounded like somebody was killing a small child.
Yes.
It was very violent sounding.
Yes. Too many fucking children at the resort. So it was violent squealing, and
now we've alienated everybody with kids. All right, check that one off.
Yeah, really, they don't listen to this shit. So it was not a resort I thought kids should be at, but what do I know? So I get up and I see a female falconer walking around one of the giant heated pools on the property, and every now and then a beautiful hawk would land on her arm. And I'm like, huh. Now, I was just like, because everyone there, not everyone, a lot of people had their kids and their dogs, and there was a parrot or something, and probably someone had their lemur and their salamander on a fucking leash, and it was like very odd, like a high-end petting zoo. I assumed she was a guest. I did not for a moment think anything, but producer Mark is inquisitive and said,
I yelled down to her from the balcony. I thought, you know what I thought it was? I thought it was just like a feature that they put on for the guests. Like, watch the falconer. But
at 7:30 on Friday morning.
At 7:30 in the morning.
Yeah,
and I yelled down at her. I said, hey, is that a hawk? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, does it belong to the resort? And she said, no, it's the resort hires us to chase
contracts.
Contracts with us to chase away the seagulls. And
actually, what she said was to take care of the seagull problem, which sounded like Stu and Heidi and their band, the Negro Problem. It sounded like, oh, so your hawk takes care of the seagull problem.
Yeah, the little seagull problem with her nose up in the air.
She wasn't that way at all. We did find out that yesterday's hawk was Floyd, and today's hawk was Ava. We met Ava today. So, and Floyd was very friendly. Floyd flew up to our balcony, and so I have a beautiful picture of Floyd perched regally on the wrought iron of our balcony off of the master bedroom. And the blackbirds were flying around Floyd, like challenging him. And they were about the size of one of his claws. And he was just like, I'm going to sit here, fucker. It's my job.
Yeah.
I'm going to sit here and you're not going to come back. And I'll be darned. What are they there for about an hour and a half. And then suddenly all the seagulls and shit's gone.
I didn't see any birds the rest of the day.
Well, that long intro was to say, if only when you had Jim, if you had a pair of falconer gloves.
Oh.
That's where I was going with the extended dance mix version of why we had to tell everyone where we spent the last few days. But I actually thought falconer gloves would come in handy for so many things in life.
Yes. I
mean, just like, I don't know, poking your partner really hard and they can't get you back. No defensive wounds.
I think you're getting some ideas that I don't like right now.
I'm getting way too many ideas.
Yeah.
So speaking of ideas, 2 contributions to this week's podcast. One from one of my beloved yoga students, Jen, who gave me an exquisite page-a-day unicorn calendar for 2018. And one of the pages this week says, your gut doesn't lie about bad food or bad people. Trust it. And I think that would come in very handy when I get to this week's heinous story. And the other contributor is our a beloved tipster, Laurencia, all the way from Maine, who actually sent this story into the tipster Gmail email address. We have jttipsters at gmail.com and 832-Tipster. If you have any cases you want me to cover, if you have all the mistakes I make, if you want to call and say, bitch, that ain't true, it's this way. Anything you want to tell us, good, hopefully all good, bad or indifferent, please feel free to call us at 832-Tipster or email us at jttipsters at gmail.com. You can find us on our Facebook page. You can find us all over the gosh darn place. We won't go away. We will not. We're like a horrible virus. We're not going away. So she, beautiful Laurencia, who's very interested in true crime, sent us this story. And I'm horribly remiss that I had never heard of him. And it is a fascinating case, an awful case. He is one of the inspirations that Thomas Harris formed the character of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Gary Heidnik, and a combination of Gary Heidnik and Ed Gein. So the beautiful Laurencia had chosen Gary Heidnik as a subject for a very fascinating paper she did in college, and actually sent the paper to the email address so I could read it and the idea for the show. And by the way, she got an A, as I'm sure she always does, because I think she's probably a stellar student. So I don't want to call him Buffalo Bill, but I kind of want to call him Buffalo Bill. So Gary Buffalo Bill Michael Heidnik was born in November of 1943. And he was born in Ohio, and not long after that, his family moved to Pennsylvania, which is where he sort of landed and did his, his worst work. I'll call it that way. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and his parents had Gary and Terry. Now, Terry was 17 months younger than Gary, and we'll find later on, Gary's defense attorney is almost as interesting as Gary, because he's, I think he's somewhere on the sociopath scale. But one of the things that he used as a defense was that Terry was 17 months younger than Gary, and that was too close together to have kids, and that would make Gary a psychopath.
So wait, they were born 17 months apart.
Right.
And so later in life, because of that, he becomes a serial killer.
Yes.
Oh. I see.
And how much space is between you and your brother Phil?
13 months.
Right. Is there anything you want to tell me? Okay. So I'm not really going to say that that's a good excuse. I think his attorney is, I really can't even describe him, but you'll hear later what a fascinating creature he is. So Gary Heidnik is extremely intelligent, but he comes from, no shock, a troubled background. His parents actually divorced when he's only 3, and he spent time going back and forth between his mother and his father. He and his brother stayed with their mom for 4 years until Gary's about 7. They're both shipped off to stay with his father and new stepmother. And Gary said that he was emotionally abused by his father quite often. He suffered a lifelong problem of bedwetting, which they say, the triple threat: enuresis, bedwetting, torture or killing of small animals, and fire starting are the way we know you're going to grow up to be a sociopath and boil people's heads on your stove, which happens later on. So Gary said his father would hang his stained sheets from his bedroom window to humiliate him in front of all of their neighbors. And of course, after Gary is arrested for all of the things he's done, because he gets out of trouble several times. I don't know how, but he does. He gets out. It's a very odd system sometimes, the legal system. The people that spend time for a very long time in prison for things that are pretty small offenses and people that get the fuck out when they should be, have pencils like jammed into their ears on both sides just to straighten shit out. And of course, his father, Michael Heidnik, after Gary is arrested, is like, I never, ever would I abuse my sons. No. So I don't know. I can't hook him up to a lie detector, and if I did, I'm not sure it would work. But Gary said that he was abused. I'm not sure. I don't know what
Well, the key is verbally abused. I mean, what does that
emotionally.
mean?
He said emotionally abused.
So does that mean go out and mow the lawn? I mean, what does that mean?
Gary, you get that girl's head out of the oven. You
right.
Stop that right now. I don't really know, but he, hanging his pee sheets outside, that's not nice. I don't know that's enough.
Not.
No, it's not. It's not nice, but I'm not sure that's a good enough excuse why you grow up and eat the skin off people's faces. So he, as usual, there were signs. So Gary is brilliant, and much like when the press describes someone's age after they have been arrested and goes back through their life, they're 26 or they're 32. So his IQ is 130 or his IQ is 148. So as, obviously a genius, IQ somewhere between 130 and 148. He'd been tested several times throughout his life, different schools. So he was in a regular school, a regular public school. By this time, they'd moved to Pennsylvania. And a female student who was new was just trying to start a conversation. And she said, she's like a well-meaning young girl trying to find friends. And she says, hey, did you get that homework done, Gary? And he screamed at her that she's not worthy enough to talk to him.
Oh, well, that's awesome.
Again, there were signs. He was teased, I guess nowadays it would be called bullying. He was bullied about the size of his head. It was a very odd-shaped head. I think as he got older and he had a whole lot of hair, you couldn't really see that. He wasn't unattractive. He's just, a guy. He was a little furry as he got older, longer hair and a beard, but probably charming, a la Ted Bundy and everyone else who is a monster like that. So he was teased about his oddly shaped head, and he and his brother said that it was a result of him falling out of a tree as a youngster. I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if he and his brother came up with this plan, but it's not, again, it's not a good enough excuse. I got weird shaped parts of my body too. I hardly ever kill people because of that. But so when he's 14, his father kind of talks him into going to this military school. It's now defunct. It's called the Staunton Military Academy in Staunton, Virginia. And he went for 2 years. He did leave before graduating at the age of 16, but he was very, very smart. He went back to a public school, but he dropped out, and then he finally joined the Army when he was 17. This is where some of the testing comes in. So he's, a lot of testing, I guess, when you're in the military. So he served 13 months in the Army, and during basic training, Gary's drill sergeant graded him as excellent. And after basic training, he applied to several military hospitals, military police. He wanted to be a specialist. He was denied and rejected all of those things, but he was sent to San Antonio, Texas to be trained as a medic, and he did really well in medical training. I actually thought when I started reading the story that Laurencia sent us that he was going to be another angel of death, that he was astute at medical training and nursing, and he was going to kill people that way. And no, he has a much more interesting plan, preying on those who are truly unable to defend themselves. He's a charmer. So he studies to be a medic, and he does really great at medical training. And he didn't stay in San Antonio very long, and he's transferred to a Army surgical hospital in West Germany. But within weeks of being in Germany, he starts complaining of severe headaches, dizziness, blurred vision, nausea. So a hospital neurologist diagnosed him with gastroenteritis.
How does that transfer to headaches?
Right. But he also noted in his file that he displayed symptoms of mental illness, and he prescribed stelazine, which is an antipsychotic. So it's pretty bizarre. He's got gastroenteritis, and he's, criminally insane. So he's transferred to a military hospital in Philadelphia, where he's then diagnosed with a schizoid personality disorder, and he's honorably discharged from the military service. Now, here's where it gets more fun. Shortly after his discharge, he is a licensed practical nurse, and he enrolls at the University of Pennsylvania. He drops out after just one semester. But he works as a psychiatric nurse at a Veterans Administration hospital in Coatesville, Pennsylvania.
Oh, now wait a minute. Okay, wait. What?
Mm-hmm.
He's got a medical record with the Army that says he's nuts.
Yes, it was longer words than that, but yeah.
And they put him to work with mental patients.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps they thought that he would relate.
I love the government. I do.
Well, he was fired for poor attendance and rude behavior towards patients. I guess he's like, "Oh, you pipe down in there, Sergeant. You're crazier than a shithouse rat, and I should know. I'm eating rat turds right now."
God.
Yes. So from August of 1962, when he is fired for poor attendance and rude behavior toward patients at the Veterans Administration Hospital, until his arrest in March of 1987. He's in and out of psychiatric hospitals. He attempts suicide 13 times. In 1970, he comes from this family of people who just, I guess, they just take the short road and end their lives in very odd manners. So in 1970, his mother, Ellen, who was diagnosed with bone cancer, was suffering the effects of alcoholism in her body. She was, losing the physical battle. And she committed suicide by drinking muriatic chloride. That doesn't sound like a fun way to
Seems like
go.
there might be a more peaceful way to off yourself.
I know. I'm not, yeah. So Terry, the 17-month younger brother, also spends a lot of time in mental institutions, and he attempts suicide, several times too. So it's like, I don't know if it's in the DNA. I can't really, I don't know how this works. But so in October of 1971, this is where his plan really starts to gel. He incorporates his church that he started called the United Church of the Ministers of God, and has 5 followers. Now, we don't know this at the time, but what Gary Heidnik wants to do is achieve mortality by impregnating as many women as he can, just, spreading his seed throughout Philadelphia and having a bunch of weird, kids who want to commit suicide, who are mentally deficient, and who have Gary Heidnik as a dad. So it's not a solid plan.
Praise the Lord.
Yes, it's not a solid plan, but it's the plan he picks, and he starts his church with only 5 followers. But by 1975, Gary Heidnik opens an account with Merrill Lynch under the church's name, and the initial deposit was $1,500. And within several years, he has amassed over $500,000. And in, 1980s money, that's about, 1.2 mil.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
With his church.
With his church. Now, ask me what he invested in.
I don't know. I can't even imagine. It's probably something gruesome.
Slightly gruesome. Playboy magazine and Tasty Cakes.
Okay.
I think if you're reading the Wall Street Journal and you're like, I got to get me some Playboy magazine and some Tasty Cakes.
Well, they're solid investments.
Apparently solid, because he, has a large amount of money. and he buys himself a Rolls Royce and a Cadillac Coupe de Ville. So while he's getting more followers into the United Church of the Ministers of God and amassing his fortune in his shrewd stock holdings, he has a child with a woman named Gail Lynn Cow, names him Gary Jr., but he's immediately placed in foster care because he tends to have children with uneducated, poor, most of the time mentally deficient sex workers that he finds on the street and impregnates and has children. It's very sad. So he has the child with Gail. He also has a rental property, and he's charged with aggravated assault because he carries an unlicensed pistol, and apparently the tenant asked for something he didn't want, like maybe upgraded counters, and he shot him. It grazed his face. The tenant was looking at a place for rent that Gary had, and he didn't like what he said, so he just...
And he wasn't arrested for that?
He was charged. I don't know if the person, failed to press charges. I don't know what happened, but he was charged, but I don't know that he was actually convicted.
Geez.
Good times. So he meets another woman and has a child with her. She was the longest lasting relationship he had. Her name is Anjanette Davidson. She's illiterate and mentally disabled. They have a daughter, Maxine, who is also, again, put in foster care. And shortly after Anjanette had the baby, Heidnik and Anjanette go to the mental institution where her sister Alberta is being housed. They break her out on a day leave, and he keeps her prisoner and locked in a storage room in his basement. So after a day of being out, the staff of the mental institution's like, "Where's Alberta? What happened to Alberta? Did she leave with that other girl and that man? We should probably find Alberta." Now, I get it. It's 1978. Maybe you don't keep a big, close eye on people in a mental institution, but perhaps you should.
Might be a good idea.
It might be a good idea. So they go to Gary's house and find her. They return her to the hospital. She's examined, and it's revealed she's been raped and sodomized, and she has gonorrhea.
Nice.
Yeah. So Gary Heidnik is arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. I think that means up the butt. And interfering with the custody of a committed person. So all of that is a beautiful, beautiful thing that he has done to his girlfriend's sister, who is, also mentally, diminished. So he spends 3 years incarcerated in mental institutions because his original sentence is overturned on appeal. So they put him in a mental institution, and then in 1983, he is to be released under the supervision of a state-sanctioned mental health program. Now, this is not an indictment of the Pennsylvania mental health programs that are state-sanctioned, but I'm not sure how you let someone out, how you release someone who hasn't spoken for 3 years, you refuse to speak the entire time you're there, and you're at your parole board hearing, and instead of saying anything, you write on a piece of paper and slide it over to the parole board, "The devil put a cookie in my throat."
Okay, wait. Time out. This is at his parole board hearing. He hasn't spoken the entire time he's been locked
for
up.
3 years.
He's up for parole. He could get out. He doesn't say anything at the hearing, but he hands a note to the parole board that says what?
"The devil put a cookie in my throat."
And naturally, they said, "Oh, well, we're going to keep this guy in here." That's just crazy.
Well, I don't know how to break it to you. They were like, "Thank you, Mr. Heidnik. Do you have a recipe for that cookie? Here's your belongings. You run along now. You have a good day. Try not to rape any more mentally diminished mental health patients."
This is too much.
Now, what do you think the flavor of cookie the devil would make and put in your throat? What do you think that would be? Oatmeal raisin?
Oh, oatmeal raisin is
Oatmeal
definitely Satan's cookie.
I think so too.
Yeah, extra cinnamon.
Extra cinnamon, oatmeal raisin cookie made by Satan right next to Pepperidge Farm's Mint Milano in your grocer's shelves area.
Yeah.
The devil put a cookie in my throat.
And out you go, back out into the world. Sounds
Bye-bye.
perfectly fine to us.
Bye, Mr. Heidnik. What do you use for your cookies? Do you use butter? How do you make how's the devil? So he's out. Isn't that awesome? And what does he do? He still has his funds from his wonderful church. He is pissed off because he can't find Aunt Jeanette, apparently three years in a mental institution of not speaking, but yet writing notes about the devil's cookies. She's decided to, take a pass. So he feels like society owes him a wife and a family. So he's going to make that happen all the time, all day, every day, 24 hours a day. Gary Heidnik and his wives and babies of women who don't really want to be his wife or have his baby. So in 1985, he has spent 2 years romancing a woman from the Philippines. He's using what's called a matrimonial service, which I think means mail order bride in today's language. And her name is
meant it back then too.
I've never heard of a matrimonial service. To me, that means a guy who performs your marriage, but I guess that's something different. So he spends 2 years corresponding by mail with this poor sweet girl named Betty Disto. And she arrives from the Philippines, to this rich white guy who has his own church. He's obviously a man of God. Small G. I'm going to say small G. She arrives in September of 1985, and they get married in October of 1985 in Maryland. Now, the marriage doesn't really last long because she finds him in bed with 3 other women. And I'm pretty sure she thought that she was going to be the only wife.
Well, that's what you get when you assume.
Right. And then, and then he offered her the devil's cookies, and she's like, "I'm out. I don't like cinnamon raisin, oatmeal raisin with cinnamon, extra cinnamon." So they're not married very long, and apparently he forced her to watch him have sex with other women. She said that he repeatedly raped and assaulted her. So with the help of the Filipino community in Philadelphia, she's able to take leave of this horrible marriage in January of 1986. So he doesn't know when she leaves that she's pregnant. So on September 15th of 1986, she gives birth to a son she names Jesse John Disto. So that's now his third child out of wedlock. His first baby with Gary Jr., foster home. Second baby with Aunt Jeanette, named Maxine, foster home. Third baby, Jesse John Disto. And she is smart enough to not even give the poor kid his heinous father's last name. He is not Jesse John Heidnik. He is Jesse John Disto. So he receives a request for child support payments. And he's like, "I don't know what you're talking about." Okay, so by this time, he has not been able to find Aunt Jeanette. He has lost Betty to divorce. He has 2 kids in foster care and one that just needs child support and doesn't want to be near him. And he decides to make his own wives and children for his immortality under the United Church of the Ministers of God. So, much like every intelligent person with an IQ of between 130 and 148, how do you get what you want? Why, you take it. You take it. So the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, his first kidnapping is a woman named Josefina Rivera. Now, Josefina is a sex worker. She's very clear that she was on a street corner. He came by in his Coupe de Ville. He suggested a price, takes her back to his home. They have sex. He then hits her on the head and renders her unconscious. And he takes her downstairs to a large hole he's dug in the basement of his home. Now, Josefina is very tall and thin. And there is a video of her that was shot in 1990 you can access on YouTube. It's not a good video. In fact, I was playing it and producer Mark walked by in the hallway and heard what Josefina was saying, and I could see your face fall.
Oh, it's pretty horrific.
Yeah.
It's pretty, and she looks terrible.
Yes.
And it's hard to watch.
Yes, and you were like, who is that and what happened? Well, she, is this, she's very smart, but obviously a lot of challenges in her life. So he tries to put her in this hole in his basement 2 days before Thanksgiving. And she's very tall and she doesn't fit in the hole. He didn't dig it deep enough. So he starts hitting her on the head again to make her fit in the hole. And she figures out if I crouch down, he won't hit me anymore. And he puts a board over the top of the hole. So between November of 1986 and January of 1987, he kidnaps 4 more women and he holds them captive in this pit in his basement in North Philly. He kidnaps a total of 6 women, Josefina, the 4 others, and a last woman. But the last woman is only a kidnap victim for 1 day because blessedly Josefina comes through for all the other girls and herself. And again, if you want to see the video, there's about a 15-second video with Gary Heidnik that is disturbing because it's a guy who if anyone's ever seen the interview that Tom Snyder did from like Corcoran prison with Charles Manson, where Tom Snyder is trying to, they say the definition of insanity is you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And you can almost see Tom Snyder devolving. He's trying to be a sane person asking an insane person questions. And he's talking to Charles Manson, who is mocking him and answering different questions than what Tom is asking. And it's just kind of a mess. And that's Gary Heidnik, who looked you in the eye and answers questions. These poor journalists, it's these 2 dudes who are just, they are outfoxed by a million. And they're asking him a couple questions and he's like, me. I mean, he's like, off the rails. So that's a very short video, but the one with Josefina is about 9 minutes long, and it'll tear your heart out because it's really awful. So he has Josefina. November 25th of 1986, he kidnaps Sandra Lindsay. On December 3rd, 1986, he kidnaps Lisa Thomas. On December 23rd of 1986, he kidnaps Deborah Dudley. January 2nd of 1987, and Jacqueline Askins on January 18th of 1987. Now, the 6th victim, Agnes Adams, is kidnapped on March 23rd of 1987, but that's the day that Josefina is like, oh no, oh hell no. She finally gets out, and the rest of the girls do too. So 2 of the girls don't make it out, Sandra and Deborah, for different, he does different things to them. This is terrible. So Gary sets up a system where there has to be a lead girl. Most of the time it's Josefina because she was the first one, but there's always a chance that someone could move up the rankings. I guess, because he's so shrewd with the stock market, their stock could be higher. And the girls end up sort of trying to battle it out because they know it will keep them alive. So Josefina said she remembers exactly how long she was there by herself, and it was 27 hours. She remembers because she can hear a clock radio. Gary either left a television turned up really loud or a radio turned up really loud so that the neighbors wouldn't hear any screams, because when you have a bunch of chicks in your basement in a hole with a board on their head, they're going to scream. And who can blame them? So for 27 hours, she's by herself, I guess, before he comes back and lets her out. And she was actually really happy when Sandra Lindsay showed up, and she called her Sandy. So Sandra Lindsay was mentally diminished, had a mother and a sister who were looking for her when she didn't show up. It's early December. It's right around, it's before Christmas. It's... The police handled this really badly. Really badly. And, Julius Armstrong, who was the detective, was like, look, I found out that she had a job and she lived on her own. She was able to take care of herself. Well, okay. If you're missing and you're mentally diminished, maybe someone should keep looking for you. And the extent of his looking for her, he said, I knocked on Gary Heidnik's door. I didn't get an answer. I left a message for anyone known as Gary who lived there to contact the West detectives.
Oh, that's great investigating there.
Well, thanks, Detective Armstrong. Don't go out of your way. So Sandra, I guess, was fighting back and didn't want to be held hostage and wasn't making anything easy for Gary. So she also had a problem with her jaw, that it was difficult for her to eat quickly. So he gave the girls bread and water, the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. It was actually crackers and water, but he called it bread and water. And Sandra couldn't eat fast enough because her jaw was misaligned and she ate slowly. He yelled at her to eat faster. When she didn't, he tied her arms to probably a heating or water pipe in his basement. Now, Josefina and Sandra are both tied and chained. Around their ankles are braces used to hold a muffler on a car.
So muffler clamps.
Muffler clamps, yes.
Jeez.
That's what he's using to hold the girls. So he handcuffs or muffler clamps Sandra Lindsay to a pipe standing up, and her head hung, and after 3 days, she suffocated, which is what they think that happened, was what happened to Jesus Christ. He died of suffocation, or asphyxia. So she was suffocated by the weight of her own head. And Gary Heidnik comes downstairs and says, kick her, and she's not moving, kick her. And so Josefina goes over and tries to tap Sandra, who doesn't move. So he must have had a thing for maybe tall, lanky women, but he doesn't know exactly how to get rid of her. So he dismembers her, but he has problems dealing with the arms and legs. So he wraps them up and puts them in the freezer and marks them dog food. He cooks her ribs in the oven, but he boils her head in the pot on the stove. Now, the neighbors, besides hearing the radio and TV up really loud and some girls screaming, complain about the horrible odor. And the police come to the door and they knock and they knock and they knock. Finally, he answers and they say, "What is that smell?" And he says, "Oh, I was cooking a roast and I fell asleep and it burnt." The police see the bottom of the pot on the stove that looks burnt, and they leave.
So all of a sudden, dead body smell is the same thing as burnt smell?
I'm thinking he used some sort of a wonderful like Glade plug-in that maybe helped.
Yeah, that must have been it.
Yeah, I'm guessing he had to do something to keep him from smelling exactly like boiled head. Right. So on Christmas Day, Gary comes down to the basement with a Chinese menu and says because it's Christmas, they can order anything they want from the menu. And then the next day, I guess Boxing Day, he comes down and gives them Pop-Tarts in the morning and a plate of rice and hot dogs at night because, you know, he's a giver.
Yeah, what says Christmas better than hot dogs and rice?
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know who these sources are, but it says several sources said that he ground up some of the flesh of Sandra Lindsay and mixed it with dog food and then fed it to some of the victims. But of course, none of that's really proven. There's, no evidence found in his Cuisinart. And his attorney said, oh, no, he made that story up to try and bolster an insanity plea. I'm telling you, his defense attorney is a real piece of work. You're gonna love hearing about him. So in the meantime, Sandra's mother and sister are looking and doing a much better job than the police are of finding Sandra. So they ask around town. They know that she's, got some mental disabilities. They, are tracking down friends. And one friend says, oh, yeah, I saw her get into Gary's car. And she's at Gary's. These two women, Sandra's mother and sister, track down Gary and probably are the ones who told Julius Armstrong, Gary has Sandra, please knock on his door. And if he says he's making a roast, it's a lie. So they go to Gary's house and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea. I don't know who Sandra is. I don't know what you're talking about. But then he realizes, hey, shit might be getting a little closer than I thought. So he brings a box of Christmas cards downstairs to the basement wearing gloves, has Sandra sign one, and it says, Mom and Sis, I'm fine, happy holidays, and he puts $20 in the card, has her touch it with her fingerprints on it, and mails it to her mother's house. And her mother and sister are like, wait a minute. That's not Sandy. Sandy wouldn't send a card with $20 in it without calling us for Christmas. It's ridiculous. So Gary drives to New York to mail the card to Sandra's mother, hoping that they'll think that she, is living on her own, just left town, and just didn't want to be around her, family anymore. And he's hoping that that'll keep them from coming around the house. Her sister's like, this is really out of character. This is ridiculous. So they take the card back to Detective Armstrong and said, can we have a handwriting analyst look at it? But Detective Armstrong is like, look, I think she's missing voluntarily. And she's content with the way it's going. And this is where I'm going to stop my investigation.
This guy is just a real champ.
He is really, he's a doll. And if anything happens to me, please do not get Julius Armstrong out of retirement to look for me because I would just stay gone wherever the fuck that was. Wherever I was taken from, but I'm not going to be taken. So, Deborah Dudley starts to fight back a little bit. The youngest of the kidnapping victims, Jacqueline Askins, is pretty compliant. And it was January 18th that she was kidnapped. But Deborah Dudley was kidnapped on January 2nd. And she really is just not going to put up with anything. So he puts her in the pit where he had kept the women before he chained them up and filled it with water. And then he takes the other girls and says, get in the pit with her. And they do. And they put more water in. And then he says, get out. And he strips an extension cord and holds it into the water and fatally electrocutes Deborah Dudley because she was not compliant. And he disposes of her body in Pine Barrens, New Jersey. Now, he drives to Pine Barrens with Josefina in the car. And of course, hindsight being, whatever, 2020 or whatever you think it should be, they ask her, why did you go with him and not escape? And I can't imagine what it would be like to be a sex worker on the street. Your life isn't great. Someone kidnaps you, rapes you, hits you in the head, puts you in a dirt hole in his basement. I mean, I don't know the true psychological part of Stockholm Syndrome. I just know that it has been documented enough times that I believe it can be something that happens. And like I said, Josefina comes through in the end, and she does save herself and the other girls that are allowed to live. But she went with him to Pine Barrens to dump Deborah Dudley's body. So the youngest, like I said, the youngest girl, Jacqueline Askins, is kidnapped on January 18th. She said that she was wrapped in duct tape, went around her mouth. He stabbed her with a screwdriver. I mean, I don't even know all of the monstrous things he did because I don't even know. Yeah, I don't know that all of them have actually even been right. So there are 4 girls left. 2 have died. One, he boiled her on his stove. The other he dumped in New Jersey on March 23rd of 1987. And this is 4 months into his reign of terror. 4 months he did all of this. He says to Josefina, I want to go find another girl. So on that date, she goes with him in his Coupe de Ville, and they abduct Agnes Adams. Now, Josefina Rivera says, I know of another girl. I know of, Agnes Adams is 24. All these girls are in their 20s except for Lisa Thomas and Jacqueline Askins, who are 18 and 19. She says, I know of another girl. I can get her. And Gary says, okay, well, we'll go get her. And Josefina says, well, I know where she is and I have to go by myself. She's not going to trust you. I'm going to go. And she talks him into it. And she says, you know what? I've proven myself. I went with you, to dump Deborah Dudley, and I went with you yesterday to kidnap Agnes Adams. So I think I can do this. I know I can do this. So she convinces him to park at a gas station on 6th and Girard. And she says, I'll be right back. And she walks about a block and then starts running. And she goes to her old apartment where she and her boyfriend lived. She bangs on the door, and he answers and says, where have you been? And she says, I've been held hostage by a crazy man who thinks he's starting a church and impregnating women. And I've been in a pit in his basement, and he's killed 2 other women. He tried to kill me and some other girls. And her boyfriend says she's crazy and shuts the door. So
You've got to be kidding.
I am not kidding. I am not in the least kidding. I'm going to guess they're not still together. So she runs around the corner and finds a phone booth. And she calls 911. And David Savage, former police officer, responds to the call. He finds a female at 6th and Oxford. And she tells him the story about being held captive and chained up, and that there were other people in the basement. There's other girls. And at first they're like, And then they notice that she has marks on her ankles that have been rubbed raw from the muffler clamps that were around her. So they follow Josefina back to the gas station and they find Gary Heidnik. And they arrest him right then and there on March 24th. And they get the girls out of the holes, whatever girls are alive at this point, Josefina, Lisa, Jacqueline, and Agnes. And he is denying everything, saying that the women were in the basement when he bought the house.
What? This is like, oh yeah, it's like there's a ceiling fan that stays with the house, and you've got 4 girls in the basement.
Right. There's 6 girls. 2 of them didn't make it, but yeah, there's these beautiful window coverings, and those are yours. And the 6 girls in the hole in the basement are also yours.
Yeah, I just signed this disclosure here.
Right,
it
right.
Comes right with the house.
We told you about it, and the crew from HGTV is coming in to do some remodeling, and they are also aware of the 6 girls. No, that didn't happen. So he immediately tries to hang himself in his cell. So he is put on suicide watch, which is kind of a shame because I wish they would have just let him die then. But they, house, feed, and clothe him for another 12 years before he is executed by lethal injection. But in the meantime, the circus that is his life and his defense attorney is pretty fucking fascinating, including, but not limited to, his daughter with Aunt Jeanette, Maxine Davidson, and his ex-wife, Betty Disto Heidnik, file a suit in federal court with the Eastern District of Pennsylvania asking for a stay of execution on the basis that Gary is not competent to be executed. After 2 years of legal proceedings in various different courts, it's overturned, and its final ruling clears the way for his execution, which is 3 days later, July 6th. The ruling finally came down on July 3rd of 1999, just before July 4th. So his attorney, Chuck Peruto, I'm pretty sure was angling for a book deal or a TV show or something, because he is a hot mess. A hot mess.
Well, I already like the name Chuck Peruto.
Chuck Peruto.
You know you're dealing with high-quality legal advice there.
Yes, Larry H. Peruto. He's amazing. He says to the press that he is getting tons of crazy jokes sent to him. I don't know if it's via email or carrier pigeon or just like a can with a string that's attached to his brain that only he can hear, because he says that jokes are coming in like, "Hey, Chuck, I heard that you only charged Gary Heidnik an arm and a leg."
Oh, for God. Okay.
"Hey, Chuck, I hear that Gary Heidnik debuted his own brand of clothing. It's called Dismembered Only."
Really?
Yes, sir. These are quotes.
Oh, next stop, the Comedy Store.
Yeah. He's a headliner in the making. Headliner in the making. He actually said, some of the jokes were funny and some of them weren't. What? You fucking nightmare. He also says, "I wish I had the chance to retry this case now." Well, too bad, Chuckster. Gary took a needle to the arm, which I think is a good thing for all of us. But my favorite event with Chuck Peruto is actually during the trial, which he couldn't get the insanity plea. He couldn't get the court to accept that, no matter how, partially because of the testimony from Heidnik's broker at Merrill Lynch, who said he's a shrewd investor, Playboy and Tasty Cake, and he's amassed now $550,000 in in the bank. I'm pretty sure he's not insane. So he's sentenced to death on July 1st, 1988, and incarcerated in the State Correctional Institution in Pittsburgh. In January of 1989, he attempts suicide with an overdose of his prescribed Thorazine, which is, what you give someone who's psychotic, so I'm not really sure. We can debate who's crazy, who's not crazy. Apparently, boiled down, no offense to Sandra's head, is if you walk around the street killing people and you're like, what? I can do that. That's not a problem. I'm allowed to. You're crazy. If you kidnap women, try to secrete or hide your deeds, and your entire goal in life is self-preservation, then you're not insane. If you're smart enough to know that what you're doing is wrong, then you're not insane. So, Gary's attorney, he probably really should have just gotten anyone else. But, I hope he didn't pay Chuck a lot of money, but maybe he did. At one point, while Gary is being questioned on the stand, Chuck Peruto spins around and looks Gary in the eye and says, "So, Gary, when Sandra's head was on the stove, what seasoning did you use?" And Gary stared at his attorney for a long time and said, "Man, you're crazy."
Yes.
"Hello, Pot.
Okay.
Call from Kettle. He says you're black."
If this were so tragic, this would be high
yes.
comedy.
Yeah, your attorney's trying to prove that you're crazy, and your client says, "Who uses seasoning? What, like, with Mrs. Dash?
Oh, my.
What do you put on Sandra's head? What goes good with Sandra? Red or white?" I'm not really good with wines. So at the end, Gary becomes a staunch proponent of abolishing capital punishment because he says he's fighting for all of the innocent people, including himself, because them bitches was in his basement. He can't help it. He bought a house with 6 bitches.
Wow.
In his basement. So yes, he wants to come out against capital punishment. He wants to be a poster child. Oh, he's a poster child, all right. So one of the jurors, and this could absolutely be a debate for another day, Marcella Lenhart, says, "Heidnik certainly seemed lucid enough to amass a small fortune in the stock market, and he certainly was aware enough to cover his tracks to a certain extent when he kidnapped those girls. I just don't know if he's crazy or not. I thought the defense could have been better." What?
Yeah, that's an understatement.
Yeah, the defense could have done a better job. Thanks, Marcella. With the way that everything was brought up by the defense attorney, we had no choice but to arrive at the conclusion we did. I regret voting for the death penalty, and I didn't have a choice the way the law was written. I have wrestled with my decision. I guess I could have held out. I feel horrible for Marcella Lenhart and everyone else on the jury. I don't know how they could have come to any other conclusion that he knew what he was doing. He killed those 2 women and would have killed the other 4 if Josefina hadn't gotten them all out. But when a psychopath goes on a rampage and destroys so many lives, the friends, the family, the victims themselves, the number of lives that are impacted is not even accounted for in most stories, because the people that serve on a jury, they're impacted. This woman has obviously spent many years of her life, as she says, she wrestled with her decision, and she could have held out, but she didn't, and I think it's a good thing she didn't, but I bet she will never forget that she had a part in ending someone else's life who ended 2 other people's lives. And it's a horrible set of dominoes when one psychopath knocks down the dominoes. We don't even think about the number of other dominoes that follow behind that. So that is the story of Gary Heidnik. And thank you, beautiful tipster Laurencia. and more cowbell.
And remember, if you've got a tip for Melissa, give her a call at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837. Or send her an email to jttipsters@gmail.com.